Welcome to Actualize, a podcast focused on the intersection of performance, ambition, and mental health. I'm your host, Rob Pintwala. My goal for the show is to not only celebrate success, but also shed light on the challenges and sacrifices that come with ambition. Actualize is brought to you by First Session. Launched in 2019, I started First Session to help you find the right therapist. First Session is purposely designed more like a dating website than a clinical website, as we're completely focused on helping you find the right fit the first time. My team and I interview and vet our partner therapists, so you can simply browse videos, see who you vibe with, and instantly book a session. Check us out at firstsession.com and see why more than 7,000 Canadians have chosen First Session to find a therapist. Today's episode is with Kelly Hrudey. Kelly is a former professional hockey player who played 15 years in the NHL, retiring in 1998. He then joined the hockey broadcasting world, where he currently works at Sportsnet as an analyst for Hockey Night in Canada and as a commentator for the Calgary Flames. Kelly is a mental health advocate, and during our conversation today, Kelly talks about his own struggles during his playing years and also in recent years. He also shared about his daughter, Kaitlin's struggles with mental health and intrusive thoughts and OCD. We get into the details about anxiety, panic, and intrusive thoughts and what they can feel like, why it's beneficial to seek out professional help sooner rather than later. And we also chat about the current state of culture surrounding mental health in the hockey world. Kelly is a great example of someone leading with vulnerability, and he's a great example of someone who is breaking the stigma. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Kelly Hrudey. All right, Kelly Hrudey, thank you so much for joining me today on Actualize podcast.
My pleasure, Rob. Thanks for the invite. I'm looking forward to having this chat.
Me too. So we're recording here. It's the end of September, and this is kind of the tail end of your off season now. Or I guess it for the last, maybe 30, 45 years-ish, right? And I'm curious, how was it? And, how are you doing after this summer?
I'm doing great. The season seems to go longer and longer. If I'm not mistaken, Rob, after the final game in Vegas this year, when they won the cup, I think came home on June 18th. And so I've been off ever since, which is, so great. It's good for my mental health. I was around town for a little bit. We live here in Calgary. And then we took off on a nice little golf trip. I'll bore you for a few minutes, but one of the things my wife and I love to do together is golfing. And so on our way to Predator Ridge, which, if you're not familiar, is a beautiful golf resort about 15 minutes south of Vernon in the Okanagan. It's a 36-hole course. I call it my happy place. But on the way out there, we love driving. So we stop in a little town called Golden and play their beautiful little course. And then we stop in Revelstoke, another beautiful little town, and we golf their course before we make it out to Vernon and stay there. We were there 15 nights, and our kids and our grandchildren, everybody, all our kids' spouses, everybody, they were able to join us for a full week. And then we made our way back here to Calgary, went on another golf trip, went to Kyle and Dana Bukowskis, their wedding in Canmore. So we've had a busy summer, but really restful, and I'm ready to start the season again.
That's incredible. I love that. I love that area of, the West Coast here in Canada,
Yes.
and that drive, and those golf courses must be absolutely gorgeous. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when did you become a grandfather?
Well, Maverick's 5.5 and Archie's 2.5. So that was in February of 2018. I'll never forget this. So we, of course, knew Jessica was close. I was on the road. I was in Manhattan, of all places. It was a Friday night, and we're getting ready for the game. Rick Ball, my broadcast partner, and I were in the press box. I'm going to say warm-up just started. So we're really preparing for the game, going over lineups and things. And then my phone is ringing. It's my wife, Donna. And she goes, "I know you're busy, but I think Jessica's just gone into labor. And so you can expect at some point later tonight that you will become a grandfather for the first time." And so, how distracting, right? I mean, it's an important game between the Flames and the Rangers, of course, but this is a bigger moment in our family, in our lives. And so somehow I get through the game. I'm super distracted though at times. I think I even sent a tweet or something out there that I apologize for all the people watching the broadcast. I was distracted. Everybody was amazing. There were congratulations and so on. And anyways, we're staying at the Ritz-Carlton in Battery Park at the time. The Flames they went on elsewhere, but I had to stay the night because I was flying the next morning to Toronto for Hockey Night in Canada. And so I remember sitting at the Ritz-Carlton bar having a glass of wine and a little bite to eat. And Ryan Leslie, our sideline host, was with me. And I just couldn't contain myself. Anyways, I get up the next morning, I fly to Toronto, I do the show. Of course, Ron McLean mentions Maverick's birth and so on. And then I flew home on Sunday. I was supposed to continue on with the Flames elsewhere. I can't remember. And my bosses at Sportsnet said, Kelly, you don't have to go on the road with the Flames this upcoming. Go home. And I think they gave me something like a week off to just be around the family and stuff. It's such a great memory. And the same with Archie when Archie arrived. And just as you can tell, I'm just bursting out of the seams with excitement when I get to talk about them.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's amazing that you got the week off. So I got this. I've been excited about this conversation for a while. I grew up, I'm from St. Catharines, Ontario. I grew up playing hockey my whole life. It was pretty much my only sport until later
Yep.
in high school when I realized I wasn't going to the NHL. And but really, like I think the where I'd like to steer this conversation a little bit is in the mental health realm, which is where I work now, in Canada, but it doesn't really matter where you are, of course. And yeah, so when in preparing for this conversation, reading a little bit about your career briefly, I always knew who you were growing up watching hockey. And now of course, I see you on TV. And what I noticed and why I reached out is because I see you, being a little bit more open and vocal about mental health personally for you.
Yep.
And after doing some reading, your family as well. And I just wanted to maybe like start back to your hockey days of playing and understand like when mental health sort of just came on your radar. Like when did it become a thing for you that you had to be conscious of?
Okay, so this is an interesting look back on my playing days. So in the summer of 1992, I believe I was going into my 10th year in the National Hockey League, so 92, 93. But during that summer, I started to have what I thought were some pretty rational questions of myself, like how much longer can I keep doing this? Donna was pregnant with our third child at the time. Things like, how long can I sustain this level of play? What am I going to do after I'm done playing? All those rational thoughts that most people have, right? And knowing fully that, as I said, going into my 10th year in the league, the average career is ballpark around 3 years. And so I know I've already exceeded that. And at some point, it's coming to an end. And I didn't know what I was going to do after playing. And so, valid concerns, there's no question about it. But where it went in the wrong direction at some point in training camp and definitely in the early part of the season, those thoughts went from rational to irrational. And they went from, you can't do this anymore. And strangely enough, Rob, I got off to the best start of my career that year. And I was fighting all these thoughts and I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know anything about the loop and I didn't have any tools to break the loop. And so those thoughts are going round and round. And as you can imagine, and you're aware, they get louder and louder and they just don't stop unless you have the tools to break that. And I didn't. So it became pretty much unmanageable. So in early December, I went in a ditch and I couldn't get out of it. Luckily for me, my coach, Barry Melrose, in January of that year, this is an extended slump now. Barry recognized I needed help and not physically, but mentally. And so he introduced me to Tony Robbins. I won't get into the specifics. And so to work with Tony was a game changer for me, literally, not only just on the ice, but myself mentally. And he gave me the tools to break that loop and to understand it, maybe more than anything, how to understand it and to focus on different things. And so, interestingly enough, I had gone from playing really well to probably the worst goalie in the National Hockey League to going to the Stanley Cup final that year. And so it was quite the journey, quite the roller coaster, as you can imagine. And having said that, Rob, I ended up playing 5 more years in the league because of the concern that Barry had for me and the help from Tony. But I didn't know that was related to mental health. I had no idea. And as you can imagine, in the early 90s, not many people were talking about it, and certainly men in professional sports were not talking about mental health. And so I was fighting this pretty much alone with the help of some people. My wife, of course, was a great support for me, gave me great comfort. But it wasn't until I started to recognize mental health through our daughter, Kaitlin. Kaitlin was 12 years old when she was diagnosed with OCD and anxiety. She's now 30 years old and still battles every day. I'm happy to say she's doing great right now. But it wasn't until Kaitlin went through her stuff in the summer of 2005. And then it was really in the fall of 2005 when she was going into grade 7, I believe. And she literally, I wasn't there that day, but my wife was dropping her off at school and she couldn't get out of the car. And so we knew we had a big problem. Kaitlin went into extensive therapy for years. And finally, after 4 years, she came to us. So now she's 16 years old. She said, Mom, Dad, I'm starting to have more good days than bad. Well, what a profound statement to hear from your 16-year-old daughter. And so through that whole journey, learning to breathe with her and helping, understanding about the loop, she taught us about the loop and all these different drills and exercises and things we had to go through as a family. Not only the three of us, Kaitlin, my wife, and I, but Caitlin's two sisters had to learn a lot about it and to be understanding about what she was going through. So that's quite the journey. And then in 2017, I decided to write a book with Kirsty McClellan Day, and it's quite an experience and quite an emotional experience to write a book. And finally, we're winding down the process. I want to say in August of that year. And we're finishing up and we're having a session at her house. And I'm grinding away and we're going over just some final things, language. Like there's a few swear words. I didn't want very many swear words because I don't really swear a lot in my life. I want to clean a lot of things up in that book. And then finally, I just blurted out something. If I'm going to be real, then I've got to go back to 1992, 93, because I'm telling a lot about myself and some other people in the book. But the biggest chapter in the book that I'm leaving out is that year and how my mental health got the best of me. And so it's kind of like a whew to get that off my chest that, okay, I've now admitted I've had this issue. And it was interesting because I was going to meet Donna and Kaitlin at Earl's for dinner that night. And so I asked Kirsty to send me a transcript of that chapter. And so I let them read it at the bar. And so it was quite overwhelming, to go through that.
Yeah.
And then, I was good, so basically from 93 to 2019, we all have our stretches in our life where it's a little bit harder to manage, but pretty much I have to say I went through pretty unscathed. And then in the summer of 2019, I started to get those same thoughts. And this time I did recognize what was happening, Rob. So I knew we're out at Predator Ridge, strangely enough, because as I mentioned earlier, I consider it to be my happy place. And yet those thoughts will get you at any point in your life and you have no idea when and why and where you might be. And so I was thinking, I want to say I was entering something like my 20th year on national television. And I started to have the same thoughts. Well, how much longer can I do this? What if it comes to an end? Those are rational thoughts. It is coming to an end at some point. And then they went into the start of the season in October. Strangely enough, it ramped up really quickly. So it's 3 weeks in and those thoughts were becoming unmanageable. They were like, well, you better be perfect every single night, which is impossible on live television. I've never had a perfect night. I've had some okay nights, but I've never been perfect. And then all of a sudden it was a grind that year. And I'm disappointed in myself in the sense, Rob, because I knew what was happening and I knew after experiencing life with Kaitlin, the importance of getting help. And yet I waited. And so the start of the season, 2019, and then March of 2020, of course, the pandemic hit. So that certainly didn't make it any easier. It made it more difficult. And then finally, I want to say I did, good thing for me. I did talk about it with my family. I just mentioned to them that I'm not doing very well, and I kept putting off to go see somebody. And then finally, I want to say in fall of 2021, I did go see somebody, which was a great relief to me. I was so nervous, boy, to go drive to that person's office, and then I think I cried for the entire hour, which felt great. And
Mhm.
then I saw that person weekly for months and months, and it just such a game changer. The advice I would have to anybody out there that might be watching this is don't be like me. Don't wait so long if you know something's happening. I should have known better. I've been around it. I should have known better. And it's too painful to do it alone. And I'm just, happy I did it. And now I'm doing much better. I had a tough year this year, but I'm making strides to improve that. Today, in fact, is the day I'm making my appointments coming up to see the person that helps me and just make sure that I'm on top of it before the season starts.
No, I love that, Kelly. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I just think it's incredible that you're open about this. I think correct me if I'm wrong. You're in your 60s now, and
Yep.
I know your generation. I think my father's probably about 6, 7 years older than you, and it's not just your generation, but I'd be a millennial, right? And it seems like people. I love what you said about not waiting.
Yeah.
Don't suffer alone.
Hmm.
But it still seems like, it's just you let it wait until it gets to the point where it's unbearable, and then that's you're almost forced to make a move, and I wish it wasn't the case, and I think
Hmm.
the stuff to try to make it easier for someone to connect, with a
Right.
therapist. But, what was it like you said you sort of cried the first session,
Yep.
tell me a little bit more about, like, taking that step. Was it back in 2020? Was that the first time that you sought this,
I
you know,
2021.
more recently? 2021.
Yeah.
So after like a year and a half of,
Yeah.
pretty intense suffering, it sounds like.
Yeah. And it was just, you know, I don't know how to put it in context. I think that I think a lot of people would feel like me that, okay, well, this week it's going to get better, or today it's going to get better. It's not going to be as bad. And what my thoughts were, it didn't really have a lot to do with day-to-day living. It just had going on television. And so if that's what you do for a living, and now you're beating yourself up about being perfect, and the pregame show on Saturdays were becoming very difficult to get on air. A lot of it was at home because back then we're working remotely, so it wasn't quite as bad. But when it really ramped up in September of 2021, I was in Toronto. That might have been like the third wave of the pandemic. I felt very alone because I was there by myself, but the hotel I was staying at was like a ghost town. Nobody was out in the streets. Restaurants were closed. After every show, there was no, like, I'd like to go out and have a glass of wine and maybe a little snack after the show. Every restaurant was closed. I had to go to this little convenience store, come back to my room. So I felt very isolated. I was just in my room or at work. There's nothing to distract me. And that's when my thoughts really got going. And finally, I really did recognize then that when I do get home, I'm going to see somebody. And I did. It's still like that to this day. Like I said, I had kind of a bad year this past year traveling to Toronto and with the Flames. And a lot of it had to do with, I know at times because I have the tools, I have to fight through. Like I do recognize I can't just go see my therapist all the time. I do have the tools. I can fight through an uncomfortable day. That's harder to do than, just say though. Sometimes it just really gets you. And it's especially difficult when you're away from home and you're alone. My wife is great though. She calls me all the time, asks how I'm doing, or I call her when I'm desperate and she'll walk me through it or talk me through it. And so that partnership is so important.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's incredible. And so as far as, I think the two broad categories I think people think about in mental health is anxiety and depression, for the most part. And
Hmm.
many times those two happen, they're intermingled at the same time. And I think, at least for, and maybe we can kind of focus the conversation a little bit more so on men. I know that y- you don't always hear about men with anxiety so much. I mean, I think it kind of comes out in many senses in maybe frustration or anger
Hmm.
and panic, right? I guess panic would be definitely in that realm. And, I have friends as well who, again, never struggled, but certain point they started having panic attacks, right? And it's almost takes that, and it takes repeated doses of panic attacks to do something about it. And I'm curious for maybe, I think for men, they're often thinking about like, well, is this bad enough? Like, is this, I'm not suffering as much as someone else looks like they're suffering. I can
Hmm.
handle it. And there's so much, I'd love to hear from your perspective in terms of the waiting time that you waited to seek help. Would you attribute that to like shame or, any feelings of, you know, societal like norms and needing to fight through it? Like you still say like, oh, I have the tools, I can do it, like myself. Like, how do you attribute that? Because I think a lot of people are stuck to the point where they're devaluing their own suffering,
Hmm.
and it's easy to look elsewhere to say, I'm not suffering as much as other people. Maybe even you look outside of your country, outside of your neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
But why does that not work? I guess is my
Correct.
question.
Yeah. Well, there's all that. Everything that you mentioned, I can relate to. It's for me, and everybody, every single person's different. But for me, I was always a fighter. Just for me to play pro hockey took every ounce of willpower because I wasn't as talented as a lot of people. So I had to sort of will it to happen. I had to fight and fight. And then you go through all the highs and lows as an athlete and you fight and fight, go through some mental health challenges. I only know to fight. And so there's that part of it why I didn't go see somebody earlier because I thought I could do it on my own. I hoped I could do it on my own. A little bit of the shame for sure. But I think that I've experienced now what you are talking about with panic attacks. I listen with Kaitlin, I heard of panic attacks, but until you have one, you don't know what they are. And I've had now since. I get triggered now, which I never, of course, I knew what the word meant, but until you get triggered, and I think I've been triggered 8 or 10 times now in the last 2 years, 3 years. So I understand that now because I've lived it. I'm now journaling, which Rob for me has been a great help. That's really beneficial for me, in particular, to look back and say, "Holy, I didn't realize I was in this spot, this desperate spot." And it's kind of rewarding, fulfilling to see when you have good days after that, and that you are capable of some really good days. And so, all this has been everything that you're talking about. I've experienced. I wouldn't say though that I'm depressed. I have other things that I go through for sure, anxiety, and it comes out in panic for me and definitely OCD. And, it's funny, I was doing a podcast about a week ago with Ron McLean, and we're talking about OCD and how, interestingly enough, OCD can be beneficial for a lot of people. And I think it is for me. And there's a good part of that it helps my brain get organized, get motivated, do the things properly. It's when it takes control in the manner it does for me, then that's where I've got to start to sort of understand it and not allow that to get the best of me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I don't know a ton about OCD, but I know a common term to represent some of the sort of symptoms or condition
Hmm.
is like intrusive thoughts. And I think what you were explaining to me before,
Yeah.
that sounds like what was happening. For people who maybe are like not aware of that sort of definition and not aware of how many people struggle with that, is there any sort of like is there anything beyond intrusive that people should know in terms of like looking at these thoughts and trying to, the loop, you mentioned that word a few times, like what should people maybe be aware of if they might be
Well,
thinking that?
yeah, my understanding is OCD comes in many different forms. So most people think of the washing the hands and all those sorts of things, or counting is a big one as well. I do a little bit of that, the counting, but for me, strangely enough, it gives me kind of relief if I can do this thing. A bit of a loop, but not really. It's distracting for me, which is a good thing. But in terms of for myself, I my OCD, when my thoughts go in the direction I don't need them going, they make me doubt myself. So I can't do this anymore. I'm not good enough. All these things that they want to sort of ruin me in a day or in a certain time frame in a day. Whereas Kaitlin, her OCD, she has thoughts, and to this day, she wakes up every day thinking about getting a disease or dying. She has to battle these thoughts every day that she's not going to get uh, a brain tumor today, or she's not going to get. She thought for the longest time in her life she was going to go blind, and so. But she does have to rationalize that. So what if I do get a brain tumor? Then she's got to go through. Okay, well then I go, the doctor and I, we get a plan, we go, we get the help we need, we do all these things. Or, what if I get a cancer? Well, there's steps it takes. So she has to rationalize those sorts of things the same as I have to rationalize that, yes, I can do it. And, interestingly enough, again, when I worked for Tony Robbins, I had this laminated index card that I carried around with me that I looked at the start of every game and the start of every period, and I did it for the rest of my career. And I kept it in this little shaving kit that I had in my hockey bag for every game. And now I'm doing the same thing. I've just made a little index card that I laminated that I carry in my wallet every single day. And oftentimes, Rob, you will, if you notice now, you will see this little card on the desk on Saturday night on Hockey Night in Canada, and or almost every day on the desk in the playoffs, because I need it. It gives me 6 little reminders about why I can continue to do this job. And it's really good. It's a real comfort level for me to look down at that card just before we go to air and know I can do it again.
That's awesome. I love that. How has the community at your, current job been supporting you through this? Have you been able to be open with the others? How's that for you?
Amazing. Nothing but to support and love, and just they're so good. In fact, this year they came to me during the final. So I think we just finished one of the games, and my boss said to me before the game, if you have like 10 minutes after the broadcast, I'd like to meet you back at the hotel. We can have a nice chat about next year, which of course means this year coming up. And he said, we're really concerned. We want to make sure we're doing everything in our power to make sure that you have, you know, a successful season and not too stressful for you. So we'd like you to maybe look at the schedule when it comes out, and you can maybe look at being a little less busy. And so we've done that in the last 2 weeks now. We're looking at the schedule. I'm taking a few Saturdays off this year, which I've never done. And just to make sure that I manage my mental health. And the other community I'd like to, and by the way, my other boss is my producer that I work with every single Saturday in Toronto, a guy by the name of Brian Spear, has been just amazing. Like, he calls me on a Friday afternoon. I might be in Toronto already, say, how you doing? How you feeling for the show tomorrow? And we just have these great chats. And then I have another community that kind of surprised me, and that's the social media community. So I don't do a lot on social media about work. In fact, I probably do zero, but I do 3 things. My Friday night dinners on the road somewhere, and I like that, just sharing where I might be having a meal and glass of wine, and then the golf trips that Don and I take, and then my mental health. And that community, they've been so supportive, and I find it really heartwarming that people say, "Hey, way to go, Kelly. Thanks for sharing. Helps me." And that's good stuff.
That's what caught my eye. I think it was your
Yeah.
Twitter account. Absolutely. And it's incredible. Curious a little bit more about the current role, broadcasting, performance, pressure.
hmm
It sounds like it's a great setup, or at least maybe as good as it can be. I'm sure there's tons of anxiety about being on live television in general. But I'm curious around the like, what might you be able to share around performance and when you're on a hockey team, there's points and there's all these stats to record.
Hmm.
You have your save percentage and how many shots you took and all these things like
Yeah.
that as a goaltender. Are there similar things in broadcasting? Like, are they measuring the almost contributions from different members who are on the television, and are they trying to figure out, can we get more viewers based on this group of people? Is it that kind of calculated, or are there those pressures that, you have to perform a certain way to satisfy this audience, or how does that work? Or am I way off?
No, you're bang on. At least that's how I feel. I feel when you're on a show like Hockey Night in Canada, I mean, the longest running television show in Canadian history. And, you get a lot of eyeballs every single Saturday and more so in the playoffs when you're on every single night. There's no doubt that you feel pressure to perform. And it's very much like playing goal in that sense that it's live. And so every mistake is right out there in the open and you can't hide from a mistake. And so you have to learn how to roll with the punches that way and just sort of laugh it off and no biggie. You're going to make more mistakes. And so that's been really good for me to sort of, and you've heard this saying many times recently. In fact, I think people are in the last 5 or 10 years talking a lot about this, about be kind to yourself. And so I've learned to do that a little bit better. There's still room for improvement, but I made a big step in my life broadcasting wise during the pandemic about a year or so ago, 2 years ago. So doing a Flames broadcast with Rick Ball, and I'm the color analyst. And so at the end of every broadcast, we record this hit that goes into the late night sports show, right? Sports Central. And so that clip is run over and over again. And well, I take that back. Most often it's recorded and it's not taped live. On occasion, we go live. So this one hit we're going to do after a game was going to be recorded. And so if in theory, if I booted it around, I could have just said to the producer, hey, let's do that again. That wouldn't be entirely unusual, right? Because you want to look good and you don't want that loop going round and round all through the night where people are going, aren't these guys professional broadcasters? And that was lousy. Can't they do a better job? So there's always that. But this particular night, I wasn't a very good broadcaster and I was terrible in that recorded hit. But this is an important step for me. I think I even told the producer that's going to air. I needed to get into my truck that night outside the Saddle Dome and be comfortable with a bad performance and just breathe, go, whew, that's okay. You know what? That's okay. I wasn't good tonight, but not everybody's good all the time. And that was a real big step for me. And as you can tell, there's something that perfection, and that's okay to chase perfection, but it's okay to not be perfect and make tons of mistakes. And I think it's a good message for my kids, for other people, that you're not going to be perfect. And it's an impossible task to chase that, and don't do it. Just be kind to yourself and be as good as you can be, but don't beat yourself up because like a lot of people, I'm the master at that at times.
Yeah, no, that resonates a lot with me.
Right?
Absolutely. I wanted to now ask a little bit about the culture in the game of hockey, and I guess we can direct it at Canada here. Well, I'll preface it by saying this, and I was thinking about this morning before chatting with you. So I'm from Ontario, grew up playing
Hmm.
hockey at the youngest age, tried to be at the most competitive level. I got very lucky and made AAA the first year I could, and
Wow.
where I got most improved 2 years in a row, which said something. 2 years. So that was great, and really hockey just took over. I saw my parents' dedication, and I was in it, and most of my friends were through hockey and that, and I
Yeah.
could see my brothers and my nephew and my niece doing the same thing just outside of Toronto now. And now I live on the West Coast on Vancouver Island,
Mm.
and it's not quite as that hardcore as I'd say in the
Gotcha.
GTA. And I'm starting to come across people who now have a little boy myself and some friends with children out here. And there is this opinion of hockey players that I'm actually starting to hear more than just one-offs. And I'm curious because folks out here, and I'm trying to figure out if it's, now in 2023 or, if it's a different view of, just on the West Coast here, the culture and the sort of macho culture and the arrogance maybe of, the view of young hockey players being these sort of cocky
Mhm.
kids and turning, a lot of sort of parents, at least out here, off the game. And,
Yeah.
when I was growing up, I definitely noticed that. I noticed some of the, guys on my team maybe being a little bit more outspoken and maybe arrogant. Didn't really notice it really. Like I tried not to follow in those footsteps. But at the same time, like, have you noticed anything change over the last few decades with that culture? I mean, we're talking about mental health and, you're, the people that folks look up to, yourself and your colleagues on air and anyone you have on, the alumni and folks in the NHL. But where do you think the hockey culture has come in like a positive way, and what might you think it still is still struggling with? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it has to change. It has to become more inclusive. It has to rid itself of some of the arrogance. I think that if I were to turn it around a little bit, though, and go through my experience from when I grew up to where it is today, that's a major positive step. Certainly not where it needs to be yet. But I think when you have great people like Sheldon Kennedy doing all the great work that he does and telling people about we haven't done enough, looking at the changes at Hockey Canada, what they had to go through, and they're trying hard to become a better organization. I see a lot of progress. Rob, if I were to tell you some of the things that I went through back in my day and, in the 70s and 80s, those I'm happy to say for the most part, none of those, nobody playing hockey today will go through similar experiences, or at least I hope not. And I don't think I'm naive to some of the things, but, I think what happened back then was totally overlooked and irresponsible by so many people, and so many people were, mistreated and, just not right. And today there's still some of that going on. Don't get me wrong, and we're identifying those situations and we're making sure, or at least trying to make sure those people are no longer involved because they shouldn't be. And just even over the course of this summer, we've seen some things going on in the last few weeks about major changes to make sure that people that have no right to be in our game, they're going to be out of it. We'll identify them and make sure that the kids in today's sport have a much better experience. Again, I would agree with what you're saying. There is a feeling out there, and it's for good reason. The hockey community has earned it to a certain degree that they were arrogant and not everybody is treated properly, and it needs to be better. No question about it. I would like to see, well, we have two grandchildren, right? So I would like to see when they enter hockey that their experience is nothing but amazing. They can, whatever, however far they go in hockey, that they can look back and go, yeah, I met these friends. It was amazing. My coaches were really great. They treated me nice and I had fun every time. And not ever look back and say, boy, that year was horrible. The coach was mean. I didn't like what was going on. I didn't like what I saw. Those aren't the standards our family has, those sorts of things. So it's a long conversation. It's a good one that you brought it up because it's so important. I don't want to sound aloof or that I'm not aware of everything, but I'm a 62-year-old guy. And the great thing about our family, and there's many families out there, and I understand that have these same conversations. So we sit at the dinner table. Usually it's every Sunday. And I'm not going to say it's a heavy conversation every single Sunday, but our kids are all in their 30s. So, they understand life and they've gone through things and they teach me a lot about life and how kids in their 30s and 20s and so on, how they view the world. And, it's for me to change. It's not for them to understand how it used to be and those are the good old days. I don't live that way. I think, how's it going to be in 5 years? How's it going to be in 10 years? Because that's a better world than what it was when I grew up. And even though I had a great childhood, my mom and dad were amazing. We're not moving backwards. We're changing, and that's exciting for me. I know it's a long-winded answer, but it's an important topic, and there's lots of layers to it. And so, yes, the hockey culture has to change, but so does culture.
Really good point. I when I think of that, I think of, there's still a lot of outliers, I guess you can say, with people who are, maybe very talented, but, have challenges off the ice or something like that. But what I can remember, I mean, one of my idols growing up, and I spent a lot of time in Perry Sound, Ontario, and
Mhm.
Bobby Orr. I
Yeah.
never watched him play. I think I was too young, but like just the clips and the way he played the game was sort of like
Mm.
the level that I look to in terms of
Yeah.
the, humility and whatnot. Not that I was nearly as good, but, and I think that today's leaders, when I look at, both men's and women's hockey, like they're just most folks wearing the C and wearing the A's are, really exuding that type of leadership and humility and clean competitiveness and that sort of thing,
Yeah.
which is I think what many people just love about hockey because, I think, yes, the culture still needs to change and has been changing, but the folks usually at the top, at least from the outside, look to be the ones who you really look up to in terms of the leadership. And they may not be the most skilled, but, someone like Tavares, for example, like
Right.
I'm a Leafs guy. So, and I also like, speaking of Tavares actually, and just hearing having your second or third child, like maybe 2/3 of the way through your career and reading a little bit about how you welcomed Patrick Marleau
Yeah.
into your home towards the end of your career and just like it looks to me like you really value family, and I can hear you talking about your grandchildren and light up, and I look at that as something that I really value as well.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious where you would fit that in, you're still being here as a professional, on TV and your long career in the NHL, and like where do you attribute family into all this and to, the mental health world as well?
Yeah, well, it's a great question again. Well, if you know about my upbringing, I grew up in Edmonton in a little community called Elmwood, and my mom and dad, amazing people. I lost my dad in 2016, but he was a really gentle guy. Like, honestly, Rob, I never heard my dad say one single swear word until his latter days. It was kind of funny, really. He wasn't doing well and he had dementia and stuff, but you know, that's the first time I heard him swear. And I think all of my kids, my wife, everybody were in the hospital room at the time. And we kind of laughed because it was shocking to see my dad say a swear word. And so he was a really loving man. My mom, we still bring her here down to Calgary every once in a while. We're going up to Edmonton this weekend to see her. And they were just a beautiful couple. And we didn't have any money, but they were just great people and they taught us about family. We had all, we'd go to our uncles and aunts, our grandmothers' houses all the time. Buna and Baba were Ukrainian, so we'd call one grandma Buna, the other Baba. And then on Donna's side, she had the same thing. Her parents were super loving, and now they've since passed, but they were the same sort of family. Donna had brothers and sisters, and you know, I think to a certain degree, that's kind of why we meshed so well, that we had similar interests, that, family strong. So, and that's why we continue that tradition of, lots of family dinners and, those conversations. And you mentioned John Tavares. I'm glad you did, because when you talk about hockey culture, there's a guy that has accomplished so much. And yet when the camera doesn't lie, when he's interviewed, yeah, sure, he believes in himself, but he's very humble and he comes across as just like anybody else across Canada, regardless of what his job is. And so I just like people like that. I'm drawn to people like that, people that just really care for others, have empathy for others. And so, you know, we're always going to have a few bad people, but that will be every occupation, right? You're going to find a few bad ones every once in a while. We've got to make sure that their voice isn't too loud. But yeah, I grew up in the best of ways. I'm just always so thankful to my mom and dad for that.
Love that. I wanted to get your thoughts on the advancements in women's hockey recently with the new
Oh,
league. And I recently had the pleasure of chatting with Brienne Jenner, who we used to my team used to call her up for our team. She's a year younger than me back in St. Catharines, but she incredible leader, and it was an amazing conversation. But I mean, I'm so excited to see the women's league start. And wow, what are
yeah.
your thoughts?
Well, I'm happy for them. They got it organized because I don't know enough about it, but it looked like it was going to be a tough road in the future with two separate competing leagues. And so now that they're unified and with Billie Jean King uh, in large part behind it, it's super exciting. And the growth of the game has been truly amazing to watch how far they've come. And, I think that maybe I'm a little bit biased, but some of the trailblazers that I've met, like Melanie Davidson and Cassie Campbell Pascal and Haley Wickenheiser, and the work that they put in all those years, and they're highly successful in their own rights now that they've moved on. They're not playing anymore, but I think it's in large part because of their hard work and their efforts to see where the game is now. And I'm just so proud to call them friends. And it's so exciting to see the game and how it's taking off, and how people recognize how good the game is now.
Love that. Yeah, that's incredible. Well, Kelly, I just wanted to say as we kind of wrap up here that I do think that, you know, speaking to you today and just having you on television and just almost representing, being vulnerable and being open, I think it's incredible. And I hope that you do continue on for as long as you want and as long as you can, and on the TV for the whole country to watch. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on today. And I just wanted to pass it back to you and say, is there any final thoughts or words for any listeners, or, perhaps you want to plug your daughter's clothing line?
Okay, I'll do three things. So first of all, I'd start by I'm going to add one piece of advice. It's really important that, we have these conversations, right, Rob? Like 5, 7 years ago, two men were not going to be sitting on a podcast talking about mental health for almost an hour. We could have maybe had a podcast and talked about certain things, but we would have talked about work. We would have talked about certain other things, and maybe certainly family, but not as deep into mental health as we're going. I find that so exciting to move forward. Like, what's this conversation going to be like in 5 or 10 years? It's going to be so great that so many people are going to be a part of it. But that also is my other point. Just because, Rob, you and I can share, and I have with many other people, that's not for everybody, and I don't recommend it for everybody. If you are somebody that you're going through something and you need help, I highly recommend getting the help because it'll change your life. It'll be a much more manageable life, but you're not required to talk to everybody about it. That's not one of the things about this. If you don't feel comfortable, please don't share, because it can be heavy. It can be a bit of a burden to share maybe too much sometimes. And so I don't recommend you do that. In fact, we have somebody that we love very dearly, and they're going through things, and they don't choose to share, and that's perfectly fine. Kaitlin can share, right? She's okay. Her husband can share. And then I'll leave you with that about their More Good Days clothing. And that is the genesis from the I'm having more good days than bad. And so their clothing line, you can find it moregooddaysclothing.com. I'm wearing one of the articles right now. 10%, I believe, of proceeds goes to suicide prevention. That's very important to them. And it's just really comfortable clothing. I wear it on every single plane ride I go. So if you see me on a plane, you'll probably see me wearing a More Good Days hoodie somewhere. And yeah, it's just a great cause, and I'm so proud of them. And Rob, I'd just like lastly to say thanks so much for keeping this conversation alive. I really enjoyed myself.
Amazing, Kelly. Well, thank you. And it sounds like people can find you aside from TV on Twitter, or now I guess X.com. Is that your primary platform?
And Instagram as well. I will say this, just so if you go to those sites and you're looking for some content recently, this is a good thing. I stayed away completely from social media for basically the entire summer. I think I last was on there July 4th, something like that. And now that the hockey season is ramping up, I'll probably start doing a few things. But I just needed to be away, and I just needed to be happy and stay away from that for a while. But I will be back, and I'll be posting some things on mental health for sure.
I love that. Well, yeah, it's always good to take a break, and we'll help you
Yep,
out with some of that content from some of these clips here, Kelly. So
I like it.
awesome to chat again, and can't wait to see you on TV in 2 weeks.
You got it. Thanks, Rob. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Actualize podcast. You can find the show notes for this episode, as well as all other episodes, at firstsession.com/podcast. If you like this podcast, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time.